All right, people are feeling a little shy today. That's okay too. Let's get started into the review of last week just to make sure we didn't completely lose everything from last week. And we'll start to see that the respiratory system, which is what we're talking about today, is actually very highly related to the circulatory system, which is what we talked about last week. So as a review, last week we talked about how there are kind of two circuits within the circulatory system. So we have the pulmonary circulation, which goes from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart. And we also have the systemic circulation, which goes from the heart to the body, all over the body, and back to the heart. So we have these two main circles that blood kind of travels in, and they're going to be similar, but very different as well. So they're going to be serving different functions. In the pulmonary circulation, they're going to leave the heart with oxygen poor blood, so deoxygenated blood. And as the blood goes into the lungs, there's a lot of oxygen in the lungs because remember, we're breathing in that oxygen-rich air. So the blood gets oxygenated there through the process of gas exchange, and it leaves the lungs very high in oxygen-rich blood, which gets sent back to the heart. And then the heart sends this oxygen-rich blood all over the body through the systemic circulation so that our cells can all have oxygen and live and not die. So this oxygen is sent all over the blood, and then the waste products are picked up, sent back, and exhaled. Last week, we also learned about veins and arteries and how veins are blood vessels that travel back towards the heart, and arteries are blood vessels that travel away from the heart. A for away. And we also learned about the structure of the heart. So the heart has 4 chambers, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, 2 on the left, and 2 on the right. So we have these 2 on the top are atria. We have 1 on the left and 1 on the right. And we also have these 2 larger chambers of the heart called ventricles. They're a lot larger because they have to pump blood a lot farther. So atria, they just have to pump blood a small distance into the ventricles. Meanwhile, the ventricles are pumping blood either all over the body or all the way to the lungs, which is near the heart, but still semi far away. So these ventricles got a lot more muscle, a lot more oomph to them, and they pump blood farther. So it makes sense that they're larger and more muscular. All right. So that was the circulatory system, and kind of following that as an introduction to the respiratory system, what do we think about organs that are found within the respiratory system? So you guys can annotate on the screen if you'd like, or type it in the chat. Circle which of these images do you think is involved in the respiratory system? Given what you know about respiratory system, what organs are involved, and what cells, what structures do you think? Yeah, I see people circling this rightmost image. Yes, very highly involved. These are the lungs, which are the kind of centerpiece of the respiratory system, or at least they're the biggest, most involved one. Definitely very important. We'll be talking a lot about the lungs today. Yeah, I see a couple of people circled this picture as well, this middle one. This is definitely very involved as well. This is a picture of red blood cells, and they are going to be highly involved in the respiratory system because that's how we transport oxygen and carbon dioxide in our blood. So remember how we had the pulmonary circulation, which sends the blood to the lungs, and then the lungs kind of allow oxygen to go into the blood. They're going to be going into those red blood cells. So yes, very highly involved. Oops, I accidentally cleared, but somebody did circle this leftmost image as well. This is a nose, and yep, also very involved as well. We can't forget about the rest of the pathway through which air enters our bodies. So it can't just go directly into the lungs. It has to pass through our noses and mouths first. So your nose is a very important organ in the respiratory system as well. It helps filter the air, and it serves as an entryway for the air to go into the rest of your respiratory system. Yep, and nobody circled the last two, which is very good because those are both not involved in the respiratory system. Here you have the stomach, which is not part of the respiratory system. It's part of the digestive system, which we will talk about at a later date. And this bottom picture here is a picture of also part of the digestive system. It's the pancreas and small intestine. So all organs that are not part of the respiratory system. So yes, good that we've identified some major structures within the respiratory system. In terms of the overall goal of the respiratory system, like I said, it's very highly involved with the circulatory system. The main goal is to bring oxygen into the body and the blood so that all of our cells have a ample supply of oxygen so that they can live, and also to take CO2 out of the body / blood. So as you know, we are going to be inhaling oxygen, exhaling carbon dioxide mainly. And the ways the respiratory system accomplishes this is by two main processes. One is breathing, as you are very familiar with, I'm sure, which is kind of transporting gas from the outside world, the external environment outside of our bodies, into the lungs. And then there's also another process called gas exchange, which is going to be transfer of gases from our lungs into our blood, from our blood into the lungs, the process of exchanging gas between our blood and our lungs. All right, so those are the main goals of the respiratory system. It will be helpful for you to just keep those in mind as we talk about what it actually does. All right, so into the anatomy part of this. What is the structure of the respiratory system? So we already saw a couple of the different structures in there. This is a more detailed survey of all of the organs. So just following the pathway that air would take as it enters through the respiratory system, it's going to enter through either your nose or your mouth. This image uses some fancy vocab of nasal cavities, nostrils. Just know it's going to enter through here, and then it's going to go down your throat, pass through an area called the pharynx, which is essentially the back of your throat. It's also going to pass through the larynx on its way down, which is your voice box. So the way I'm speaking right now is because of the way the air is vibrating flaps of tissue in the larynx. So those vibrations are transmitted as sound waves, and that's how you're hearing me. That's how I'm making sound and speaking. So larynx, your voice box. Pharynx is kind of the back of your throat. They sound really similar. I don't know why they did that. As it travels down, it's going to pass through your windpipe, which is called your trachea. And you can kind of feel your windpipe on your throat if you kind of just like tap your neck. The kind of really solid thing in the middle there is going to be your windpipe. And it's kind of very solid because it's covered with a layer of cartilage, which is kind of this kind of tough but flexible material that protects your windpipe to just make sure that it's not damaged. This is a very important pathway as it's the only way that air is going to be entering or exiting your lungs. So definitely don't want anything to happen to that. Otherwise, you might stop breathing, which would be really bad. After air passes through the trachea, it's going to split off. So we actually have two lungs, as you might be familiar with. We have one on the left side of our body, one on the right. So this trachea, this singular tube, essentially, is going to branch off. It's going to branch off into two bronchi. And then these bronchi are going to branch off even more into bronchioles and eventually ending in tiny little air sacs called alveoli. And this is all within our lungs. So essentially what you need to know is this windpipe, it kind of collects all the air that came in from our mouth and nose, and then it branches out into kind of a tree-like shape. And it branches out into a bunch of different tubes, which all end in tiny little sacs in our lungs, which is where the gas exchange actually happens. So far, we've just been transporting air into the lungs. We haven't done any gas exchange yet. No gas has actually been entering or exiting the blood. That happens on a smaller level. So this is kind of the flow of blood through our, of air through the respiratory system, how it gets in and also out. It's just going to go in the reverse direction when we breathe out. But now let's talk a little bit more about the structure of the lungs. So we kind of talked about the big picture of the entire respiratory system, but the lungs are definitely where most of this stuff occurs. So like I said, we have two lungs, a right lung and a left lung. And they're actually not completely kind of big, solid chunks. They are, but they are separated into multiple parts called lobes. So essentially they are slightly separated. These lobes are slightly separated from each other. If you had an actual lung and you could touch it and like move it and stuff, you'll be able to kind of lift up the flaps of these lobes and kind of see underneath, and they're attached to each other, so they're not like completely separate, but you'd be able to kind of lift them up, see under it, and we'll actually see some of that later. But yeah, there's going to be 3 lobes of the right lung, so superior, middle, inferior. Superior just means above. So it doesn't mean that it's better or worse. It just means that it's above, it's higher. And middle lobe's in the middle, inferior lobe. Inferior means on the bottom. So not necessarily better or worse, just like the superior lobe. And then on the right, we are also going to have lobes of the lungs, but there's only going to be 2 lobes on the left. Superior lobe and inferior lobe, and that's because your left lung is going to be slightly smaller than your right lung because it needs to make a little bit of room for your heart. So your heart is not exactly aligned in the center. It's going to be kind of tilted a little bit towards the left. So it's going to stay right here about this circle where I've drawn it. And so this lung needs to kind of be a little bit dented, a little bit smaller to make room for that. Your heart has a non-zero volume. And yeah, so that's why there's only 2 lobes on the left and 3 lobes on the right. And this is kind of the structure of the lungs. And as you can see, this diagram does a nice job depicting it. But once air passes through the trachea, it kind of branches out into the bronchus, bronchi, bronchioles, which are these tubes that get progressively smaller, and it just keeps branching out in kind of a tree-like fashion. And this kind of expands all through the lungs until it gets so small that you can't even see them anymore, and they end in tiny little air sacs called alveoli. All right, so before we get into the alveoli, a little bit about how breathing actually works. So we've talked about the pathway that air takes when it's trying to get into your lungs, but how does this actually happen? Obviously, breathing doesn't just like happen if you're like not moving anything. When you breathe, you are moving your lungs and muscles around your lungs, your rib cage. So this is a process of inspiration and expiration. Inspiration is just a fancy word for inhaling, and expiration is just a fancy word for exhaling. So inhale, inspiration, exhale, expiration. Simple enough. They sound very similar. So when you're inhaling, how this works is that your diaphragm is going to contract. And what the diaphragm is this flat sheet of muscle that kind of lies right below your lungs. And the lungs kind of rest on top of it. And it's this very muscular sheet. So when you inhale, the diaphragm is going to contract. And what happens if it contracts? This causes the diaphragm to move downwards, and it gives more space for the lungs to be in. So the lung volume is going to increase. And at the same time the diaphragm contracts, the chest is also going to expand. So the muscles in your rib cage are going to contract and they're going to expand outwards. Your rib cage is going to expand, again, making more room for your lungs, because remember, your rib cage kind of goes right over your lungs. So as this happens, the volume of the lungs is increasing. It just suddenly got a ton more space to be in. So because of this extra volume, a bunch of air is now going to rush into your lungs because the air really wants to kind of fill up this extra space that exists now. And that's how we inhale. So by contracting the diaphragm, contracting your rib muscles, we can expand the space the lung has and allow air to flow in. And this is the process of inspiration. It's quite interesting trying to breathe and then thinking about what is actually happening in your body while doing that. You can feel your ribs kind of expanding and while you're breathing in, and you can feel them kind of shrinking when you're breathing out. So breathing out, exhalation, or expiration. What happens here is essentially all of the muscles that we just mentioned that are going to contract, they are now going to relax. So the diaphragm, this big flat sheet of muscle right below your lungs, is going to relax. It's going to assume its normal shape. It's going to kind of press upwards and kind of decrease the space the lungs have. And same thing with your ribs. They used to be super expanded when you were inhaling, but now when you relax those muscles, they are going to go back to its normal position, which is going to be more tight, more small, kind of squeezing the lungs. And as this volume decreases, the air is going to be kind of pushed out as well. And that's what causes exhalation. So you might have noticed that inhalation, you have a bunch of muscles contracting, and exhalation, you have a bunch of muscles relaxing. So exhalation is going to be more of a passive process, while inspiration is more active. So you kind of expend more energy inhaling than exhaling. And of course, as we're doing this, the purpose of this, remember, of inhalation is to get more oxygen-rich air into your lungs so that this oxygen can be transported all across your body. And when you're exhaling, the goal is going to be to get rid of all of this excess CO2 and other stuff out so that you can make room for more oxygen-rich air to transport to the rest of your body. Someone asked in chat, doesn't inspiration mean dash and expiration expire? I'm not sure if you're missing a word in your message or something. I'm not really sure what you mean. If you're referring to the fact that inspiration and expiration kind of have meanings outside of biology, you're absolutely right. So like inspiration can mean a lot of things. Like in English, it might mean like having a new idea or kind of like a new realization or something. And expiration, you might think of like expiration dates on like milk or whatever. But yeah, they're going to have different meanings within anatomy, which is a little confusing. But hey, at least they start with the same prefixes as inhaling and exhaling, which are more common terms used. And honestly, if you don't use these terms, it's not a huge deal either. If you say inhalation, exhalation, everyone will know what you're talking about. All right. So this is the process of breathing. I'm actually going to skip to the alveoli first, and then we'll talk about the pleural membranes. I know I've been kind of hinting at the alveoli and referencing them for a really long time, talking about how all of these branches of the tree-like structures within your lungs are going to end in the alveoli, but never really talked about them. So here we are. This is kind of like the end of the tunnel, per se, out of the kind of respiratory tract. So as the air flows in through your mouth, down your trachea, through the bronchioles, bronchi and the bronchioles, it's going to continue branching until we get into these essentially sacs. These sacs of air, these alveoli, you can kind of see their shape, very ball-like. They look like kind of grapes, in my opinion, like a bunch of grapes or a blackberry, but they're essentially really, really small air sacs. And this is where the gas exchange actually occurs. So you'll see here, all of these alveoli are actually going to be covered in kind of a lot of capillaries, or these really, really, really tiny blood vessels. If you remember from last week about the microcirculation, we have these larger arteries that are going to branch into really much thinner arterioles that branch into much thinner capillaries, which is where the gas exchange occurs. And those go back to venules, and those go back to veins. So this is the smallest of those, the capillaries. So we've already had the blood vessels come from the heart, branch out really tiny and get to these capillaries, and that's what we find on the alveoli. So alveoli are the sites of gas exchange. And as a reminder, gas exchange is going to be the exchange of gases between the lungs and the blood. So here in the lungs, the alveoli are going to have a ton of oxygen within them because you just breathed it in and got all of that lovely oxygen-rich air. And now that oxygen is going to kind of flow or diffuse, kind of travel slowly into the bloodstream. There's more oxygen in the alveoli than there is in the oxygen-poor blood. So the oxygen is going to want to flow from high to low and go into the bloodstream. So if we have an alveoli here, this can be the alveoli. And this can be the capillary. We're going to have a lot of O2, a lot of oxygen in the alveoli, and not a lot in the capillary. So things always move from high to low because they want to equal out. So oxygen is going to diffuse into the capillary, and there's a lot more CO2 in the capillary because this is the blood that came from all over your body. All of the cells were producing a bunch of CO2, and now we need to get rid of it. So the high concentration of CO2 in the capillaries is going to diffuse likewise into the alveoli. So this is gas exchange. What I've drawn here is gas exchange. And so then what happens after this? Great, we've got the oxygen in the blood, the CO2 out of the blood. Now the blood is going to flow back into the pulmonary veins and go back to the heart so that the heart can pump this good oxygenated blood all over your body. And then what happens to the carbon dioxide and other gas in your alveoli? We're going to breathe out. So remember, your diaphragm is going to relax, your ribs are going to relax, your lungs are going to kind of have a smaller volume, and as a result, push out all of this air that we no longer want into the outside environment, making more space so we can breathe all over again and get more oxygen-rich air. And to go backwards a little bit, now that we've kind of talked about how this actually works, we can also talk about some of the structures around the lungs that are not directly involved in gas exchange, but are really important nonetheless. Pleural membranes. So if you remember from last week, we talked about how the heart kind of has this this membrane called the pericardium. These two membranes, actually, there's two layers of them that protect the heart, and they have this kind of gap between them that's filled with fluid so that it lubricates the movement of the heart, so that the heart doesn't rub up too much against the lungs or other structures around it, kind of protecting the heart and also protecting the organs around the heart from the movement of the heart. Because remember, the heart is kind of constantly beating, squeezing, moving a lot. So it's going to need some of that protection. And likewise, the lungs move around a lot as well. So when you're breathing, every time the lungs expanding and contracting, kind of similar to the heart contracting and relaxing as well. It's both going to be kind of squeezing and then relaxing. Lungs going to especially increase in volume by a ton and then decrease in volume. So it's necessary to have these membranes as well to protect and lubricate them. So in the lungs, they're called the pleural membranes. There's two of them right outside the lungs, and the space between them is called the pleural space, and it's also filled with a fluid, just like the pericardium. All right, so now to look at some lung dissections, we've kind of went through the structure of the respiratory system, how gas flows through it. And I've been showing you all of these diagrams, but they're not actually what lungs look like. So here is what it actually looks like. Yeah, if you don't like dissections, don't watch this, obviously. I think it's kind of cool, and it's not terribly gross. It's just very red, and you can see the lung, but there's no blood. You can see the lungs kind of inflating, which is really cool in my opinion. It's like a balloon almost. So here you can see the structures that we were talking about within the lungs, but this is an actual lung. So we have the pleura, which are the pleural membranes. We have the bronchioles, the bronchi, these kind of tubes within the lungs. And we also see one of the alveoli inflating. They pushed a tube into it and kind of inflate it. And then they breathe air into it, so you can see it inflating, which is kind of cool in my opinion. And then you can also see one of the other lobes of the lung. So there are multiple lobes.
Is it normal we can't hear anything?
What?
Is it normal we can't hear anything? Like, is the video without sound?
Oh, it's not without sound, but the sound was just music, so I don't think it matters that much. That
Oh,
might be kind of a problem though in future videos. I might have to figure that out. Let me see. Share sound. Okay. Well, next time I play a video, you will be able to hear the sound then, because I just pressed the share sound option on my screen share. Oh, it's flower fish dissection. That's exciting, actually. Dissections are really cool. I think it's always really nice to see the more realistic version of these organs and structures that we talk about in human anatomy, because all of these diagrams I show, they're good at representing what they actually look like, but obviously they still have a lot of flaws and are drawn to be more perfect or more ideal than what it actually is. So yeah, also always quite nice to see the real thing. Looks like melted cheese. Kind of, yeah, the lungs are actually very soft, and the way they balloon is actually kind of surprising. They look kind of solid, but they're really just giant air sacs. All right. So
how did they like remove all the blood from it?
Removing the blood, it probably just clotted. There are certain things you can do to like dissected things to make the blood clot and not come out. The blood could be dried. Yeah, or they could have just not punctured any of the capillaries or blood vessels. Well, they did when they cut it actually, but yeah, all of these things are treated. They're not like fresh lungs. They're going to be prepared with different chemicals and preservatives and like coagulants to make it ready for dissection. Because it'd be really inconvenient to have a bunch of blood squirting over your dissection. And actually at my school, there's a human anatomy class where they dissect a cat. And I know that when they dissect the cat is prepared so that they actually drain out all of the blood. I'm actually not sure how, but then they refill the blood with kind of a latex material that's kind of like bright pink and bright blue. So when you're looking at the dead cat, it's like got bright pink and bright blue lines all over its body, which is kind of weird looking, but so cool. All right, there's another, I'm pretty sure the other one was not a human lung. There's another video of a human lung, but we will move on from that for now and just watch it later if you have time. Or you can check it out on your own after class too, if you're into that sort of thing. That one's a little more advanced anatomically. All right, so we've kind of talked a lot about the functions of the organs within the respiratory system and how it works. Now we're going to talk about when it doesn't work. So some diseases of the lungs. One of the diseases of the lungs is pneumothorax. So we just talked about the pleural membranes and how there's two of them and how there's kind of a tiny space between them called the pleural space, which is typically filled with the fluid, serous fluid, which is liquid. And this liquid, this really thin layer of liquid, just helps reduce the friction when the lungs are moving around and rubbing against everything around it, and kind of allows this movement to be more fluid. But sometimes air can get into the pleural space if there's like a puncture in it or something like that. And this is really bad. If air gets into the pleural membranes and into the pleural space, pressure can build up. So all gases, all the air around you is exerting a pressure on everything around it at all times. And there's an air pressure within the lungs as well, of the air filling your lungs, kind of pushing out against the lung walls. But if there gets to be enough air within the pleural space, the pressure of the air in the pleural space can increase so that it actually overcomes the pressure of the air within the lungs. And when this happens, the air pushes against the lungs and essentially causes them to collapse, which is really bad, as I'm sure you guys will know, because then you essentially can't breathe through there. You can't get much air in there, and you've just lost half of your lung function. So that's pneumothorax. It's very bad. It's essentially getting into air, getting into the pleural space between the pleural membranes. Another respiratory disease that is extremely relevant right now is COVID-19, which is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which I'm sure you guys have been hearing so much about recently. It's all just all over the place and kind of hard to escape part of our lives. But this is what the coronavirus looks like. If you're unfamiliar, viruses are kind of these debatably alive particles that are essentially some nucleic acid like DNA or RNA, surrounded by a layer of proteins with some random stuff sticking out of them. They're very simple, they're very, very tiny, and it's a common debate on whether or not they're actually alive, because they need to infect other organisms in order to reproduce. They can't reproduce on their own. So this is what the coronavirus looks like. It's going to have its RNA genome within it. So it's not DNA, it's RNA, which is very similar to DNA, but slightly different in its structure. And this is going to be surrounded by a layer of protein, or a layer of membrane, just like our cell membranes. And then on the cell membrane is going to have these spike proteins, which are very characteristic of coronaviruses. And it's also kind of what gives it its name. So the spike here, you can kind of see it looks a bit like a sun, which is what corona means, sun. So you can kind of see the circles and the spikes coming out of it as a sun. That's why it's called a coronavirus. But this virus, essentially what it does is it goes into your respiratory tract, into your alveoli, and using these spike proteins, it's going to bind onto the cells, the surfaces of the cells in your lungs, and then infect them, allowing their RNA genome to go inside your cell, and your cell will convert the RNA into protein, making a bunch of new coronaviruses that can infect other cells. So what is actually the bad part of the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus? What does it actually do within your lungs? So like I said, it's going to go into your alveoli, which, remember, are those really, really tiny air sacs. And then it's going to infect those cells. It's going to go into these cells, infect them, and our lungs do have an immune system within them. So it's not going to just sit around and wait for the coronaviruses to just infect everything, all the cells within your alveoli. So your body is going to launch an immune response against the virus. It's going to cause inflammation. It's going to cause your blood vessels to kind of enlarge and allow more things to go through so that more immune cells, more nutrients can go into this place of injury. And it's also going to recruit a bunch of other immune cells to come into the alveoli and try to clean up all of the debris that's happening, because all these cells are dying because COVID is infecting them. And this ends up being kind of bad because the inflammation causes your airways to kind of become smaller. When your tissues become inflamed, they kind of swell a little bit. So that will decrease the radius of your airways, making it harder to breathe, which is why you see shortness of breath as a very common symptom of COVID. And another thing is because your blood vessels are becoming more permeable, you're going to have a lot of like liquid buildup within your kind of tissues around the alveoli, and also in extreme cases within the alveoli, which is going to give you the instinct to cough to try to get rid of it. So that's also why COVID kind of causes a symptom of COVID is coughing. So these are the main things that kind of cause the symptoms we observe. And one more thing about vaccinations. So hopefully a lot of you, well, all of you are probably able to get vaccinated now. It's approved for your age groups. And this is kind of how COVID vaccines work. You might have heard about how they're a little bit different than normal vaccines, or like what vaccines have typically been in the past. Like if you've had like flu shots or like vaccinated against like measles or polio or tetanus or anything, you've probably got some vaccinations in your life. COVID vaccines are a little different, at least the Moderna and Pfizer ones. They are what we call mRNA vaccines. So typically, vaccines work by injecting viruses that have been kind of inactivated or kind of fully killed so that they can't actually infect you, or parts of viruses or proteins from viruses injected into your body. And what happens then is your immune cells have an opportunity to recognize this foreign particle, become familiar with it, produce these antibodies, and kind of remember what it looks like so that it knows how to fight it off the next time. So on the second time, when you get infected with these viruses, your immune system has already seen them before, and so they can fight it off more quickly, and you will recover or just not get sick. So what the mRNA vaccines do is, instead of directly injecting the complete virus or the intact proteins, it's instead going to inject a kind of instruction manual for making the viruses. So this mRNA is a structure, a molecule that essentially is a code for a protein. So once this mRNA is injected into our human cells, once it's traveled into our human cells, structures within the cell called ribosomes can convert this mRNA into proteins, essentially making virus particles actually within the human cell. And then these virus particles are transported out of the cells into all over your body so that the immune cells can get exposed to it, recognize it, and fight more effectively against them the next time it comes across it. So yeah, essentially that's how they work. And for the coronavirus specifically, a very favorable protein to find the mRNA for is the spike protein. As I mentioned, it's very important for the virus getting into and infecting human cells. So they took this highly identifiable protein, the spike protein, and discovered what mRNA molecule corresponds to this spike protein, put it in this package, and sent it into your cells so that your cells can make the viral particles and learn how to fight against them. Yeah, so that's how the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines work. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is going to work kind of differently. It's not going to be an mRNA vaccine. It's going to use one of these older methods that I talked about, injecting dead viruses or parts of viruses or intact proteins. But yeah, all of them are effective. All right. And one more disease of the lung that we will talk about is asthma. So you probably know someone who's had asthma, or you might have asthma. Basically, what happens is in normal people, we have our airways that kind of have mucus lining to kind of trap bad particles, and also smooth muscle around it so we can kind of control the thickness. And it's nice and open so the air can pass super duper easily through your airways and you can breathe really well and everything is good. In asthma patients though, because of some extreme reactions to particles in your environment or whatever it might be, the causes are kind of not too well established and can change from person to person. This causes your lungs to react in a bad way. So the muscle is going to tighten, it's going to contract, making your airways thinner and kind of swollen because of inflammation. And also there's going to be a lot of excess mucus, which is kind of this sticky substance that traps a bunch of particles and dirt and whatever that's not actually supposed to be in your airways. And the net result of this is that the airways become really small, really thin. So it's a lot harder to breathe. That's why people with asthma have to be more careful when exercising, and also sometimes carry around inhalers, which essentially contain chemicals that trigger the expansion of the airways. So you can purposefully cause your airways to expand a little bit by including chemicals that cells respond to, so that the airways become larger and air can pass more easily through them.